we have to zero in on some pertinent questions. The first thing I want to ask you, in court documents, Jian Ghomeshi says that after he came to you, to the CBC in the spring, to explain what was happening, that the CBC helped to strategize what would happen if the story came out. And specifically, he says there were confidential meetings, there were conference calls, there was a drafting of media responses as well as press releases. Did the CBC work with Jian Ghomeshi and his team to strategize?
No, we had contact with Jian's team. He invited us to some meetings with his team. Chuck Thompson, who's our head of public affairs at CBC, sat in on a number of those meetings. In all of them, Chuck was very explicit and very clear that he was there as the representative of the CBC. Jian had always characterized this to us, that embarrassing information about his personal life was going to come out. He was always unequivocal that he had crossed no moral line or ethical line, that he was innocent. And we were trying to figure out how we would deal with a situation where potentially damaging information about a high-profile CBC personality came out in the meeting and in the media. And in that context, Chuck did spend some time with Jian's team. He was on calls. He was part of conversations.
Did he help draft press releases?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Why did everybody just assume that Mr. Ghomeshi was telling the truth?
So, really for me, this story started in mid-May when Jian came into my office and, told a story to me about a woman that he'd been in a relationship with, who was now telling, again, what he characterized as embarrassing details about his personal life. Mm-hmm. That he was worried that this would end up in print or in the media, that it would damage his reputation. He was the one who came to me with the information.
So you didn't know in April when he first came to people at the CBC?
I don't believe that he came to anybody at the CBC in April. I know Heather Conway, in an interview a few weeks ago, mentioned him coming to the CBC in April. I think she misspoke. As far as I'm aware, the first conversation that Mr. Ghomeshi had with at least any executives at the CBC was on May the 16th, when he set up a meeting with me. He came, told a very compelling story to me about a woman that he'd been in a relationship with, the things, embarrassing details of his personal life that she was alleging. He looked into my eyes. He said, that he'd done a lot of soul searching, that he'd gone back in his head of every relationship he'd ever been in, and he looked into my eyes and he said, I have never crossed any ethical or legal line. He looked into my eyes and said that. I had no reason to believe that this person who I'd known for 10 years would be doing anything other than telling the truth.
Just to go back to the allegation that he makes, you say that Mr. Thompson sat in on some of these discussions. Did the CBC pay for any of that legal or public relations advice?
Absolutely not.
Nothing was paid for by the
CBC? We paid none of Jian's expenses to Navigator or any of his legal fees whatsoever.
Okay, I want to jump ahead. You mentioned May 16th, so I now want to jump ahead to Canada Day weekend.
Yeah.
Our reporting and our program this week is going to reveal that there were 2 male Q producers who came to have a meeting with you on that long weekend. That meeting happened.
It did.
It did, and you and Mr. Spencer were at that meeting.
We were.
And they brought with them, they tell us, a number of things. One was a story that they had been told by Mr. Ghomeshi in Winnipeg. One was an email from Jesse Brown laying out the STARS investigation that was currently ongoing. And one was a series of tweets that they had discovered on the internet relating to Mr. Ghomeshi. Do you confirm that that was all presented to you?
Yeah, I don't recall seeing the tweets, but I remember them mentioning them, and again, that had been something that when we'd met with Mr. Ghomeshi in May, he had said to us that again he portrayed it as the woman who he'd been in the relationship with had been tweeting things under a Twitter handle. And so that was something that we were aware of. And in fact...
Did he show you those tweets at the time? Did you know the content of those tweets?
No, he just referred... I think he referred to them in sort of, broad terms. Right. I certainly had an idea of the flavor of them. And again, he was unequivocal that the information that had been tweeted was absolutely untrue.
And you believed him?
And I believed him.
Go ahead.
So we did have a meeting, and none of the information that the employees brought forward to us on that Canada Day weekend was information that we were unaware of. The account that they gave to me and Mr. Spencer around the conversation that they'd had backstage in Winnipeg with Jian Ghomeshi was very similar. It sounded almost, word for word as they recounted it as the conversation that I'd had with Mr. Ghomeshi on May the 16th. Mm-hmm. The letter that they brought along that had been sent from Jesse Brown, a freelance journalist, was exactly the same as another email from Jesse Brown that a Q producer had given to us earlier that same week. Mm-hmm. So that was not new information. And they were making us aware of the tweets, which again, Jian Ghomeshi had made us aware of in the May meeting.
So then you knew at that point that the Star's investigation was not about one woman, it was about a series of women, that the word assault was used in that email, and that the tweets themselves referred to very specific things, namely bruises, choking, and punching. You knew that information on July week.
And I think knowing what we know now, you look at that in a very different way than you did on a weekend in July when, we had very little knowledge. What we had was information that Mr. Ghomeshi had brought to us. We had his unequivocal denial that any of it was true. Mm-hmm. The people making the allegations were unidentified, were not the police. What we had was a bunch of information that we had no ability to verify or validate. At that point, it was rumors.
So what did you do with that information then?
So in the email from Jesse Brown, the one that had been sent, that was presented to us on that Sunday and that had been sent to another Q producer, there was a very vague mention, and I think it was along the lines of, and I have reason to believe that some of this behavior may have crossed over into the workplace. Right. For me, that's a red flag, because our duty as an employer, first and foremost, is to protect our employees in the workplace and to have a safe, secure workplace for them to work on. So as soon as I read that line, all of a sudden, this did become, for a moment, a story that was more than, embarrassing things that Mr. Ghomeshi may have done in his personal life, and it was a story about a CBC workplace, and we took what we thought were appropriate steps to look into whether there had been inappropriate behavior in the workplace.
And what steps did you take?
So first and foremost, we pulled Mr. Ghomeshi's employment file, and that we verified that there was nothing on his employment file. Mm-hmm. As best as we were able, we looked to see whether there had been any discipline ever initiated against Mr. Ghomeshi, whether there had been any respect in the workplace complaints lodged about Mr. Ghomeshi, or whether his name had come up in any complaints lodged by anybody else. Mm-hmm. The answer to all of those was no.
There was no formal complaint on the record.
There was no formal complaint on the record. We then took an additional step of talking to a cross-section of people who had worked on Q. We didn't speak to everyone who worked on the show, but we talked to people at various levels, whether they were at the show management, the sort of editorial management level, producers. We spoke to the two gentlemen who had come forward to speak to us on that weekend, and we had talked to managers who had managed Mr. Ghomeshi in the past.
How many people did you speak to?
So that is the subject of what we've asked Janice Rubin to investigate. I don't want to get into the details of how many people we spoke to, who we spoke to, because I think that's actually best dealt with in that investigation. Mm-hmm. But we spoke to a number of people in a variety of positions in the organization, and all of them said they had never been subject to harassment from Mr. Ghomeshi. They said they had never seen any other improper behavior in the workplace by Mr. Ghomeshi. And they said, each of them, that they'd never even heard of any other inappropriate behavior in the workplace on the part of Mr. Ghomeshi.
Mr. Boyce, we've done our own investigation. We have gone back and we have made contact with every single employee of Q that was working there this summer. We contacted each one of them. All of them came back to us to say they had never been contacted, they were never asked any questions.
And I'm going to leave that to Janice Rubin to look into as part of her independent investigation.
Well, you were conducting the investigation.
Well, and I can tell you that I have had conversations with a number of people, but I don't think this is the appropriate venue for us to get into a discussion of the specifics and who spoke to who, but I can tell you that I spoke to people, Todd Spencer spoke to people, Linda Groen, who is a director of the Network Talk Department, had discussions with people. So I'm not going to get into the specifics because I think this is exactly what Janice Rubin is looking into as part of her independent investigation. But we came out of that with, with the information we had, believing that, we'd done what we could.
Did you speak to anybody beyond you say 3 Q producers who came to you with their concerns? Did your investigation go beyond those 3 people?
It did.
And did it go beyond the executive producer?
It did. And at that point, Gillian,
why would all these people be telling us, Mr. Boyce, that they were never contacted?
Well, I can't answer that question. That's the reason we've asked Janice Rubin to conduct an independent investigation into what went on.
You understand that this suggests that there really was no investigation, that armed with that information that you had in that weekend about allegations of assault, allegations coming from a series of women, choking, punching, that there really was no investigation.
And the majority of the allegations that we were aware of involved Mr. Ghomeshi's personal life. They didn't cross over into the workplace.
At that point, does it matter if it involves people outside the CBC? This is a man that you put out there as an ambassador for this company. If there are any allegations that come anywhere close to things like assault, do you not have a responsibility at that point?
And if we'd had any ability to follow up on that information, if any of those women had come forward to us, the Toronto Star itself never came to us with those allegations. We learned of them.
Did you ever go to them?
We did not.
Did you try to find the woman behind the Twitter feeds?
Our job is not to be the police.
Did you ever go to Jesse Brown and ask him about these women? Would they come forward to talk to you?
We did not.
Why not?
We were hearing of allegations from anonymous women secondhand, from an employee who had brought this very information to our attention and professed that, he was innocent.
But he wasn't telling you at that point, presumably, that there was a series of women, and he wasn't, or was he, being detailed about the kinds of allegations that you then learned about on that weekend? He,
again, was unequivocal at every stage of this. Every time I asked him, as new information became available, he was unequivocal in his answer that, the allegations were untrue, that he had done nothing wrong, that he had crossed no line.
And you would expect him to. I guess, and maybe this is a question of hindsight. Should you have looked further? Should you have taken the responsibility to look further?
I think, knowing what we know today, it's a very different story, right? If you look at all of the information we know today and where this story has gone, your mind goes to a very different place. I believe that when we were in the middle of it, knowing what we knew, that we acted properly. Do I not ask myself this question every day, every night, at 3, 4 in the morning? Absolutely. I don't think you could be human knowing what you know today and not ask yourself, could I have done more? Should I have done more? Mm-hmm. For the last month, I have had lawyers, human resources professionals, people telling me you did the right thing. With the information you had at the time, you did the right thing. Still, I think to be human, you have to ask yourself, could I have done more? Should I have done more?
One of the things you could have done is you could have tried to at least inquire about these things. You could have gone to Jesse Brown and said, clearly you're in contact with women who have very serious things to say about this person who is an employee of our corporation. Would you help me get in touch with these women so I can hear these allegations myself? Did it ever occur to you to do that?
We had some discussions about, what the probability would be of, Jesse Brown or the Toronto Star cooperating. In the end, we made the decision not to approach them.
Because you didn't think he would cooperate?
Yeah.
That's a pretty big assumption. How do you
know
if you don't ask?
Knowing, I think, what we know today, it's very clear what was going on. I think knowing what we knew at the time, which was an employee had told us somebody was, ready to tell embarrassing stories about his personal life and was crafting a story that was very different, not having anyone have come forward to us with those allegations directly, not believing that any of the behavior had crossed over into the workplace. We had the information that we had, and I think based on what we knew at the time, we made the best decision that we could.
On November the 7th, Heather Conway gave an interview to Peter Mansbridge in which she said that she had never heard the rumor, never, ever, ever heard the rumor that Jian Ghomeshi punched women. You were sitting on those tweets in which the word punch is very clear. Did you share that information with Heather Conway?
Honestly, Gillian, I don't recall. My belief at the time was that the tweets contained information that was wholly inaccurate. The story that I had been told by someone I'd known for 10 years and that I, clearly trusted when I shouldn't have, was that, again, an ex-girlfriend was tweeting material that was wholly inaccurate. I see lots of stuff tweeted about celebrities on social media, tons of stuff about, all sorts of people. Much of it is inaccurate.
I can understand the first time he comes to you and you trust him because you have no reason not to.
Yeah.
But now things are ramped up again. You're dealing series of women. Your words assault are being used. Specific acts of violence are being talked about. Why did you still believe him at that point?
I had no hard evidence to the contrary.
But did you look for evidence to the contrary? That's the question.
To the best that we could. We're not the police. My duty is not to be the police. My duty is not to tear apart Jian Ghomeshi's personal life. And at that point, what we believed was that something was happening in his personal life that he characterized as embarrassing.
But you were an officer of a public corporation, right? Does that not give you the responsibility to do more than just accept the word of a man you've known for 10 years?
Gillian, if somebody sent me information about you, I would hope that you would expect for me to deal with it responsibly, knowing how incendiary allegations like that
But if it was information that suggested a crime may have taken place, doesn't that supersede everything else?
I'm not the police.
So you don't think you had that responsibility, even in retrospect now?
No.
Okay, that's fine. I want to jump ahead then to October 23rd.
Yeah.
You attended Jian Ghomeshi's lawyer's office, and you were shown material that ultimately led to his departure from the CBC. What were you shown?
So what we were seeing, or what we saw, and the circumstances under which we saw it, I believe are a key piece of the grievance because it deals with the termination of his employment. So I can't get into explicit detail about what we saw, but I can, to be very clear, we saw evidence that he had caused physical injury to a woman. This was very different than the story he had told us up until that point, which was about, being interested in rough sex or, sex that was not vanilla as he referred to it. A storyline where, it was embarrassing details about one's personal life. For the first time, we saw evidence that he had caused personal injury to another human being.
Why was he showing you that?
It's an excellent question. And, that's probably a question to ask Mr. Ghomeshi. I think he believed that it would demonstrate that he was involved in a consensual relationship. I looked at it and, I wasn't assessing this in terms of, is this a criminal act, not a criminal act? It happened in a consensual relationship. Is it legal or not legal? I was looking at it very clearly through the lens of, is this conduct that's acceptable for a CBC personality? And the answer was no.
What did you think? Just what was your human reaction as you looked at it?
Yeah, it was tough. It was tough. It's those are images that I'm not, going to get out of my head soon. I think no one ever would want to or should, see evidence that somebody caused injury to someone else. It was deeply disturbing.
And he was suggesting that this proved that whatever had happened was consensual. The fact that this woman had been physically harmed.
You'd have to ask him that, but yes, that's my belief.
Yeah. Having seen evidence of a woman that was physically harmed by him, why did you not go to the police then?
It's a good question. Our understanding in consultation with our legal counsel was that from a criminal point of view, what we'd seen probably did not fit the threshold for criminal behavior because it was in a consensual relationship. I understand that there's a lot of debate to this day about whether you can ever consent to physical violence. That was the advice that we were given. Again, in hindsight, seeing what else has come out and what other information there is, what we were told at the time is we were seeing something that was the exception, something that had happened once. It didn't matter to me how many times it had happened. It was unacceptable behavior for a CBC personality.
But your lawyers were telling you that may not have met the threshold of criminal violence, but should that not be something for the police to decide rather than CBC lawyers?
Well, again, in hindsight, and this is a moment where I will be completely honest, if I could play that back in my head, there was a lot going on at that moment in time. I had just seen evidence that threw me for a loop. If I could do it again, would I go to the police? Maybe. I had no evidence of anything. I didn't have the evidence myself. That's a good question.
The next day, Mr. Ghomeshi was put on indefinite leave, and that was announced. In his Facebook posting a couple of days later, he said that at that point he was given the choice to walk away quietly and publicly suggest that it was his decision. Was he given that choice?
He was not. That is untrue. This is difficult because I don't want to get into a lot of specific details of what is the subject of a grievance, but I can say he was never given the opportunity to quietly walk away.
Why did it take 3 days to fire him then?
So some due process is required. We gave Mr. Ghomeshi initially 24 hours if he had any other information that he felt was relevant to the decision that we were about to make. I think, we knew we had information that he suffered from some mental illness and anxiety.
When did he share that with you?
I think, he'd been writing a book about his anxiety disorder, so we had some concern for his well-being, and we felt it was important that there was some due process, that he was given an opportunity to respond or present any other information to us that he thought was relevant to the decision. We were very clear with him that we were, beginning a termination process, and we gave him 24 hours.
And that was when?
That would have been Thursday night that we had that conversation. We met with him again on the Friday afternoon, at which point his lawyers expressed concern about the speed at which the termination was moving, and asked as a courtesy whether we could give them a bit more time to try to understand the situation with their client. And as a courtesy, we set a deadline of noon on Sunday.
But you hadn't even announced that he was taking indefinite leave, or had been put on indefinite leave until the Friday. So this was after they had come back to you. You gave him 24 hours to come back.
Yeah.
And what were you giving him 24 hours to do that might have changed the outcome?
If he had any other information that he thought was relevant to the decision, it was an opportunity as part of the due process to present that to us.
So he comes back Friday, 24
Yeah.
hours later, and apparently doesn't. Why was he not fired then?
So his lawyers asked, because of the speed at which this was moving, if they could have a bit of additional time, and as a courtesy, we granted them that. We made a very clear decision on the Thursday, within hours of viewing the material that we viewed, to take him off of the air, revoke his access to the building, his access to CBC computer systems. At this point, it was a question of finalizing a termination. This wasn't a question of, were we remaining associated with him? It wasn't a question of was he ever going back on the air. This was a question of, a legal question of due process and a discussion with his lawyers.
I'm just wondering why he was allowed that. I mean, due process, people can get fired on the spot.
Yeah.
You were shocked by what you'd seen. You felt it was a firing offense,
Yeah.
clearly. Why does Jian Ghomeshi get 3 days before he actually gets fired?
Well, he was off the air. Whether we fired him on the Friday or whether we fired him on the Sunday makes no material difference.
Well,
at the meeting on the Friday, his attorneys indicated to us that they did have information that they would like to present to us. In the end, they didn't, and they asked for the additional time. In the end, I don't think it changed the decision, but this was a situation where we felt, a long-term employee required due process. We had reviewed a small amount of evidence about one case and come to a decision, and in fairness to the employee, we felt it was important that he be given the opportunity to present any other information to us that he thought was relevant.
And there was no other information presented?
There was not.
Because it leaves the perception, and I
Yeah.
know you're aware of
Yeah.
this, that the CBC was prepared to let him walk away, to write his own narrative about why he was leaving. And it was only when it became clear that this was going to become public, that it was going to end up in the papers, that the CBC decided it better get out ahead and fire him.
Well, I can tell you categorically, we never presented him the opportunity to walk away quietly. As in any employee termination, we did indicate to him that there would be an opportunity to have a conversation about how we talked about his departure. We never put the option of a resignation on the table. And at that point, we had no particular information that embarrassing information was or was not going to be published. The situation on the Thursday, Friday, Sunday was no different in that regard.
Jesse Brown was tweeting on Sunday, or prior to Sunday, that he had verified information,
Yeah.
that the leave was not due to Mr. Ghomeshi's father passing away.
Yeah, and Jesse Brown also, on his podcast earlier in the week had indicated he had a blockbuster story with embarrassing information about a Canadian media personality. That was not relevant to the decision that we made. We made a decision based on the information we had at the time, which was very different than the information that we'd had in the months before. And when presented with information that Jian had caused physical injury to a woman, we moved quickly to immediately remove him from the air and commence termination proceedings.
What was his reaction when you told him that?
He was very upset. He maintained his innocence. And beyond that, I'm not comfortable getting into details, again, of something that's going to be part of the grievance process, but he maintained his innocence.
There is, I think, perhaps, because of an absence of a lot of information,
Yeah.
there is a certain cynicism, I think it's fair
Yeah.
to say, in this building about the CBC's newfound interest in sexual harassment and its determination to get to
Yeah.
the bottom of it and have people come forward, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How are you going to address that cynicism?
Cynicism is tough, right? One of the hardest things that I've wrestled with in this whole thing is why didn't people with information come forward? Because I've had a lot of conversations with people about the relationship with Jian, not about abusive behavior, but just about what the workplace environment was, how we treated people, what the human dynamic was. And I wish I'd had that information earlier.
Had you ever heard rumors about him and women and violence?
No.
I knew.
I had not. And this is one of the things that I find really difficult about this whole thing is you read in the papers that everybody knew. What does everybody knew really mean? I can tell you, what I knew. What I knew was, whispers that, Jian Ghomeshi had cheesy pickup lines and on occasion he dated younger women. Is that knowing? And what is that knowing? I've had people who worked on the Q team come up to me very emotional, saying, people are saying everybody knew. I didn't know anything. There is this sense of, everybody knew, conflating with everybody knew about abusive behavior. And if people knew troubling things about Jian Ghomeshi, I really wish they'd come and talk to me.
I guess I have to come back to this.
Yeah.
You had 2 Q producers who did come to you.
Right.
On that weekend in July, and they shared with you, and they did it because they were concerned.
Absolutely.
They were afraid that the CBC did not know. They were afraid this was going to come out, and that you and everybody else in management needed to understand this. And so I think their answer would be to you, look, we came forward. We shared what we knew, and nothing happened.
And unfortunately, the information that they brought, and I appreciate the difficulty, and it's not an easy step for someone on the Sunday of a candidate day weekend to come in and meet with their boss, but the information they presented wasn't new information. It was information that we were already aware of, and it was information that we had no ability to verify.
Well, you say you had no ability. I think people would look at that and say, surely if you were as worried about that information as they were, there were things that you could have done.
And that is one of the reasons that we've hired Janice Rubin, third party, to come in and conduct a thorough, deep, well thought out investigation. And if that investigation finds that I didn't, act appropriately, if there was more than I should have done, or there was more that CBC should have done, I'm fine with that. I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to understand what went on, and I think it is difficult because so far much of this story has played out in the media. And I think the importance of having someone like Janice Rubin come in is that she can look at all the facts, speak to all the parties concerned, make some conclusions about what went on, and hopefully make some recommendations so that something like this never happens again.
You talk about that movie in your head at 3 and 4 in the morning. When you look back in this, knowing that 4 months before this all came out in October, that you were aware of certain things, of allegations, albeit, but certain things 4 months before, do you look back and think you should have done things differently?
It is the movie that plays in your head constantly. It's a torturous process. It's every moment of every day. It's every moment of every sleepless night. I don't think in a situation like this, knowing what we do today, which is very different than what we knew then, that anyone who's human couldn't ask themselves, should I have known more? Could I have done something different?
And how do you answer yourself?
In my heart, I think with the information we had, we did the right thing. But looking with what we know today, I think I ask myself that question over and over again. But in my heart, based on what I knew then, I think we did what we could.
Just want to be on the record with this. The producers who have come forward to us obviously did so with great trepidation. They're worried, they're nervous.
Yeah.
They're concerned that this might have repercussions on their futures here. Will you assure us that that will not be the case?
Absolutely. And one of the most troubling aspects of this for me is that for whatever reason, people didn't feel comfortable coming forward. And, moving forward, that's something we need to understand. And it is, one of those questions, what do you need to do to create an environment where people feel comfortable coming forward with difficult, sometimes hard to digest information? And that's a culture that I'm committed to. It's something that's important to me personally, and I think is vitally important to the future of this organization. We've begun a discussion, and I think it's a very important discussion about a whole bunch of the issues that are raised here, and it's hard, I think, to move forward. It's hard to make the turn from dealing with horrific allegations, difficult experiences that people have had. But I'm determined to make that turn, and I'm determined to change the environment that we work in.
Overarching all of this, there was the reality of who Mr. Ghomeshi was and his importance to the CBC. Can you honestly say that that was not relevant, that he was not bigger than the institution, and therefore these allegations, these concerns, even these whispers and rumors were dismissed because it was better not to know?
We terminated Mr. Ghomeshi. If he was bigger than the organization, one would think he'd still be working here today. No one is bigger than the CBC, and I think there is an important principle here in that we know audiences identify with personalities. People tell me every day, I love Carol Loff. Stuart McLean is a great storyteller. They identify with individuals. Jian was a charismatic, compelling personality who won over Canadian audiences. That's very different, though, than somehow being bigger than the institution or above the law. And I can state categorically, no one is bigger than the CBC. There is no special treatment. Just because we, put your face on a billboard or you appear on, multiple properties, that's very different than saying someone is bigger than the CBC.
Is there anything else you want to say, Mr. Boyce?
No, it's been a horrific situation. I think it's been incredibly trying for the team that worked on Q, who through it all have been dedicated employees who have been true professionals. And I think ultimately they've shown that Q was much more than Jian Ghomeshi, and that it was the creative genius of a dedicated and hard-working group of people who, under probably the most difficult circumstances anyone will ever find themselves in, have continued to make great programming. And I think in all of this, they are the people that I worry about the most.
I just want to give you one more opportunity because I want to be absolutely fair. I told you that we did the survey, that we have not found a single person who says that they were interviewed as a part of a process. They were never asked questions. You are absolutely categorically telling me that there were people that were interviewed.
We spoke to a cross-section of employees. They were not all interviewed by Human Resources. Some were interviewed by me. Some were spoken to by Linda Groen. Some were spoken to directly by HR. But we spoke to a cross-section of employees in a variety of roles, and none of them reported any harassment or inappropriate workplace behavior, and none of them had even said they'd ever heard of any such behavior.
And this was in July?
It would have been end of June through to July.
Through to July. And can you give me a number of the people?
You know what, now we're, honestly...
I'm just trying to square
Gillian,
the circle.
I understand, but now we're getting into details of the investigation that we've asked Janice Rubin to do, and I think that's the most appropriate venue to get into the specifics of who was talked to, when they were talked to, what they were, what they were asked.
I'm just trying to figure out why people at this point would say to us, we were never talked to, if indeed they had been.
We didn't speak to everybody on the team, but I know we spoke to a number of people on the team. I can't answer that question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Can you put a number on the number of people you spoke to?
I will leave that to Janice Rubin and her investigation.